Nothing changes without individuals. Nothing remains without institutions. This remarkable institution that I'm so proud to return to, Hampshire College. I come from an institution in some ways that's similar, which we call a noble experiment. First of all, how many of you listen to or watch Democracy Now? Well, for those of you who don't, just check out democracynow.org. It's a public television, radio, news hour that broadcasts on over 1,100 public TV and radio stations around the country and around the world and translated into Spanish. A global, grassroots, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour. First, I want to congratulate the graduating class of 2013 and also say congratulations to my family member, Katie Hoffmeister, wherever you are out there. Wave. There you are. It is such an honor to be with you. I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949, almost 65 years ago in Berkeley, California. It was founded by a war resistor. When he came out of the detention camps after World War II, Lou Hill said, "We need a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists." That's how Pacifica was born. Not run by corporations that George Gerbner, the former dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at University of Pennsylvania said, "Not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today." And so Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley, 1949. The second station, KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. My station in New York, 1960, WBAI. 1977, WPFW in Washington. 1970, the same year that Hampshire was born, 1970, KPFT in Houston was born. Now that's an interesting station. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. They had just gone on the air, and the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. Now, you know, it's not as if Pacifica had money for advertising its new station. And so the silver lining was it kind of blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. When they finally got back on their feet and they rebuilt the transmitter, I think it was in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant that they blew it up again. Now, I don't know if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, an uncle from Iraq or an aunt from Afghanistan, it challenges the stereotypes and caricatures that fuel the hate groups. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take it back. You know, the group FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR.org, did a study in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. It was February 5th, 2003, that then General Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, gave his push for war at the UN, which was the nail in the coffin for so many, when he said the evidence was in that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It is a speech that he calls a stain on his career. So FAIR did a study of the 2 weeks around that speech, about 6 weeks before the invasion of Iraq. And he looked at the 4 major nightly newscasts: ABC World News Tonight, CBS Evening News, NBC Nightly News, and the PBS NewsHour. There were 393 interviews done around war in that 2-week period. 393. Guess how many were with anti-war leaders? This was about the time when about half the population was for war and half against the war. 393 interviews, only 3 were with anti-war leaders. 3 of almost 400. That is no longer a mainstream media. That's an extreme media beating the drums for war. I really do think that those who are concerned about war and peace, who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, who are concerned about global warming, the fate of the earth, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back. And that's why it is such a great honor to be here in this historic area of the United States, this place that's the nexus of two routes of the Underground Railroad, a place where Sojourner Truth lived, where Frederick Douglass visited. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of all time, actually started the North Star newspaper because it's so important who owns the media. Now, also want to give a shout out to the JB scholars here. The fact that the fact that W.E.B. Du Bois lived here, that James Baldwin taught here at Hampshire College, is such an important responsibility not only for the JB scholars, but for everyone to live up to what he deeply believed in, taught about, and fought for his whole life. I want to talk, though, about Frederick Douglass. You know, he was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he was enslaved as a youth and a teenager, and it might not surprise you to know he was a troublesome slave. And so he was handed over to a man known as the slave breaker, a guy named Ed Covey. His property was Mount Misery. Frederick Douglass was brought there, and he tortured Frederick Douglass. He beat Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass fought back. He ultimately escaped, and he headed north. He came to New York, and there's this coffee shop, independent coffee shop that I love in downtown Manhattan. And it's in this old red brick building. And outside there's this plaque that says, "This is the building that Frederick Douglass took refuge in. It is the printing press of David Ruggles." David Ruggles, born a free black man in Connecticut and lived just down the road here, also sanctifying this place, this area of the United States. So Frederick Douglass took refuge at David Ruggles' printing press. David Ruggles had a printing press. Frederick Douglass started the North Star newspaper. How important this is. These men saw media as their form of emancipation because information is power. So I learned about Frederick Douglass and where he was beaten, where he was held on Mount Misery, owned by Ed Covey. And then this was right at the beginning of the Iraq War. I learned that Mount Misery is today owned by, or was in 2003 just bought by, Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was the former Secretary of Defense, and he bought it as his vacation home on the eastern shore of Maryland, to be near his close friend Dick Cheney, who lived down the road. And I thought, is this possible that now Donald Rumsfeld owns Mount Misery? And so me and my colleague, Dennis Moynihan, who writes the column with me every week and is here with me today, we headed down to St. Michael's because, I'm a journalist, and I hope all of you journalists and anyone in whatever studies you're engaged in, you double check and triple check the facts. I mean, and quadruple check the facts and check them again and then again. I learned all this on the internet, and the internet is something so important, a great equalizing force where we can all get information. We can't let the telecoms and the video companies write the legislation that would privatize the internet. We have to keep it open and free. I'm going to talk really fast. So the corporations, have been globalizing for a long time, but it's the internet that allows us to grassroots globalize, and we have to be able to keep it unfettered. And that is why, well, it's absolutely critical, but it can also be a worldwide rumor mill, so you have to check everything you read. So we went down to St. Michael's, Maryland, and when we got to St. Michael's, we're going to check out this place, I realized we only had about an hour. I had to speak in Washington, D.C. It was a Sunday morning. I have no idea where Secretary Rumsfeld lives. So we see an organic coffee shop on the horizon. We head inside. I thought they'll tell the truth. So they said, what would you like? I said, I'd like to know where Secretary Rumsfeld lives. They said, just go down the road. You'll hit Mount Pleasant Road. Don't go down that road. You make a right and another right. You'll hit Mount Misery Road. Go down the road, and that's where he lives. Okay. We're on to something. Yes, the internet should be protected. And so we went outside, we drove, we didn't go down Mount Pleasant, we made a right and another right. It seems we couldn't go right enough. But we then went down the road, and we see the, black tinted windows of the Secret Service SUV, and we know we've arrived. So I get out very quickly. I've got my video camera, and I'm zooming in as they're zooming out. And I'm thinking, does Secretary Rumsfeld know the significance of the place that he now owns? But sure enough, I see a stake in the ground right next to the driveway that says Mount Misery. So we head off to this ancient black church down the road. They're just about to have their services, and I go inside, and older folks are sitting in the sanctuary, and I ask an older woman, I was wondering if you could comment. We just went over to Mount Misery. This is such a historic place. I mean, Frederick Douglass was born here. He was tortured there, and now Secretary Rumsfeld, who is known for torture, like at Guantanamo and in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, he owns Mount Misery. Could you say something about this? And she said, we're in church right now. I can't comment. So, from Mount Misery to Mount Hope, I was speaking upstate New York, and I was telling the story. And after the speech, a young woman student came up to me and said, could I take you to Mount Hope Cemetery? I said, I'm leaving at 6 in the morning for a talk in Denver. I'm so sorry. It was the middle of a huge snowstorm. And she said, I'll meet you at 4. Now, with that kind of persistence, how could I say no? So we pull up at 4 o'clock in the morning. She's waiting in her ski parka, and she's covered in snow. And we walk over, and she shows me the tombstone of Frederick Douglass at Mount Hope Cemetery. We wiped the snowflakes off, and it was amazing. And she said, would you come over with me one more place in this vast cemetery? And I said, I really should, please. Okay. So we go over to the tombstone of Susan B. Anthony, who's buried next to her sister. I then told the story at Wesleyan College, and a woman came up to me after and said, and then did you go to Susan B. Anthony's house? Because right near it is a statue, not of a general, but of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass having tea together. See, they were not only allies, they were friends. And this is what is so significant. These are the movements that have made this country great. The abolition movement, the women's rights movement, and I was talking about this with this young woman, but I had to race to the airport, race to Rochester Airport to get to Denver, and there I missed my plane. So I call up Dennis fast. I say, I've missed my plane. They're going to kill me in Denver. And he brings up the blueprints of the Rochester Airport. I said, I don't need blueprints. I need tickets on the next plane. He's an unbelievable researcher, and he said, I just need to know, are you in the Susan B. Anthony wing, or are you in the Frederick Douglass wing of the airport? I said, what are you talking about? He said, oh, I'm not kidding. And then I look, and there, engraved in the walkway, it says Frederick B. Douglass, and over here it says Susan B. Anthony. Every once in a while you have to stop and smell the coffee. So I got on the next plane and I made it to Denver. But these movements, the abolition movement, the women's rights movement, Today, the environmental movement, the gay and lesbian and trans movement, all of these movements are the movements that have made our country great. And speaking about the environment, as Jay Lash just pointed out, just this week, scientists are warning that the planet has now reached a grim climate milestone not seen for 2 or 3 million years. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says the amount of heat-trapping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has topped 400 parts per million. Now, you know the environmental group 350.org. I bet some of you are a part of it. Well, it takes its name from the 350 parts per million threshold, like 50 under 400, that scientists said was the maximum atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide for a safe planet. When the number hit 400, Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org, said the only question now is whether the relentless rise in carbon can be matched by a relentless rise in the activism necessary to stop it. But I really hold out hope because of you and your compatriots in schools all over the country, like Anjali Appadurai from College of the Atlantic, a place that I visited when I was a college student. Because, you know, Democracy Now!, we go to every climate change summit, from Copenhagen to Cancun, from Doha to Durban, and even the People's Summit that took place in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And I hope you all tune in. And here, it's not so much what goes on inside. It's the thousands of people, often young people from all over the world, who are saying to the people inside, why aren't you doing something about this? And they are the so-called leaders inside, when in fact the people outside are leading. Well, when we were in Durban, South Africa, this young college student, Anjali Appadurai, was invited inside to address the UN Climate Change Summit. And I just wanted to share with you some of her words. She says, I speak for more than half the world's population. We're the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises. You've heard this all before, though, she said. She said, we're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. She said the International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10, she said to presidents around the world. She said the most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where's the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. And then she started to wrap up. She said, there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. She ended up by saying, respect the integral values of humanity, respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. So she addressed the delegates, distinguished delegates in governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done. I have hope in the future generation dealing with what is the most serious challenge we face in the world today. And I wanted to end with a story that I think exemplifies this. From environmental rights to human rights to the rights of us all. And it relates to Hampshire College in particular, which is so deeply meaningful to me today. I had the opportunity to go to East Timor many years ago. It's a free country today, but it was occupied by Indonesia for a quarter of a century, and it experienced one of the worst genocides of the late 20th century. How many of you have heard of East Timor? Well, when I asked my 6-year-old niece if she'd ever heard of East Timor, this was in 1990 and 1991, She said, "I've heard of East, but I never heard of Timor." So I had the chance to go there with a colleague, a remarkable journalist named Alan Nairn, in 1990, and then again in 1991. Let me just tell you a little about it. It's 300 miles above Australia. It was occupied by Indonesia December 7th, 1975. It was a country that was colonized by Portugal for hundreds of years, but then they left, and they were supposed to go independent, but then Indonesia, with the fourth largest army in the world, attacked. December 7th, 1975. President Ford was president then. Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. They went to Indonesia. They met with Suharto, the long-reigning dictator. They gave the go-ahead for the invasion. And the next day, on December 7th, the Indonesian military invaded. Why does that connect to us? Because Indonesia was armed, trained, and financed, their military, by the United States. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. Indonesia invaded East Timor by land, by air, and by sea. And then they closed the country to the outside world and commenced the slaughter. They killed more than a third of the population of Timor over that quarter of a century. It was worse than Pol Pot's Cambodia. You know about Pol Pot and the terrible deeds he did in Cambodia, because the US considered Pol Pot an enemy of the United States. And so the reporters dutifully wrote this down, and they should have reported it. But in the case of Indonesia, the US had supported the long-reigning dictator. It wasn't only President Ford. It went on to Carter. It went on to Reagan. It went on to Bush. It went on to Clinton. It was a bipartisan affair. And so Indonesia invaded, closed the country, killed the people. I got a chance to go there in these two periods, 1990 and 91. We got to East Timor in 91 at the end of October, went to the main Catholic church in Dili, the capital of East Timor, and what we found there was a mass where the women were crying. I didn't know if it was the standard sorrow of Timor or if something had actually happened. After the mass, we learned that a young man had been killed there the night before named Sebastião Gomes at point-blank range. The Indonesian military had surrounded the church because we were there to follow a UN delegation. For the first time, a delegation would come to Timor to investigate the human rights situation. Young people your age, the graduating class and younger, were all gathering in the churches, the only civilian institutions allowed to stand, so that they wouldn't be arrested, so they could speak to the UN delegation when they came. The next day, a funeral was held for Sebastião Gomes, and then 2 weeks later, a commemoration march was held from the Motayal Church, the main Catholic church where the funeral was held, to the cemetery where he was buried. Alan Nairn and I went to follow this procession. After communion, the kids went out into the streets, the college students, the high school, the elementary students, and they pulled banners that they had hidden in their Catholic school blouses. They were bed sheets that said things like, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church?" They appealed to President George H.W. Bush at the time. They appealed to the UN. They begged people to pay attention. We went out into the streets. We followed the people as they coursed through this geography of pain. Thousands joined in the streets as they marched through the streets of Dili. They would pass hotels where Timorese were held at the back, officers' homes where Timorese women were raped. We would go to the barracks, we would pass them, and that's where Timorese were disappeared, and the police stations where the Timorese were killed. And we went through this geography of pain to the Santa Cruz Cemetery where Sebastião and so many other young people were buried. And the people marched, holding up their hands in the V sign, unbelievably brave, shouting, "Viva East Timor, viva independence, viva Sebastião." In this land where there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of press, no freedom of assembly, they dared to march together. When they got to the cemetery, they were terrified but exhilarated. And then Alan and I started to interview people. Why are you doing this? You know that the Indonesian military, which had lined the route, could take your life at any chance. They'd say, "For my mother, for my father, for my village," it was wiped out. And then we saw from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers marching up the road to the cemetery, carrying their US M16s at the ready position. We were in the middle of the crowd. Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd, because although we knew that the Indonesian military had committed many massacres in the past, they'd never done it in front of Western journalists. So we went to the front of the crowd. I'd always hidden my equipment because anyone caught talking to a journalist could be arrested, could be disappeared, could be killed. But this time we wanted to make clear who we were. I put my headphones on, I held up my microphone like a flag, I put my typewriter, my tape recorder, I slung it over my shoulder, and Alan put the camera above his head. We walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up 10 to 12 to 15 abreast. And they came around the corner, and without any warning, without any hesitation, without any provocation, they swept past us and opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. The first to go down, a little boy right behind us holding up his hands in the V sign. A group of soldiers then gathered around us, and they pulled the microphone from me. They were shouting two things as they beat me to the ground with their boots and their rifle butts. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire, and then he threw himself on top of me to protect me, and they took their US M16s like baseball bats, and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we're laying on the ground, Alan's covered in blood, they're killing everyone around us. They'd stripped us now of everything, and they're shouting two things. They're shouting politique and Australia. Politique, they were saying, this was political for us to witness this, but that is our job as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And they were shouting Australia. They were demanding to know if we were from Australia, and we knew how dangerous this was. Because you see, 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded East Timor, there were 5 Australian-based journalists covering the invasion. They got them in a town called Balibo. They lined them up against a house and they executed them all. The 6th journalist that was left ran into a radio station in Dili, the capital. He was reporting for the World. His name was Roger East. They grabbed him from the radio station, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor with so many thousands of Timorese. The Australian government hardly protested the killing of their journalists. We believe because years later, Australia and Indonesia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing Timor's oil between Australia and Indonesia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world, which is why it is also such an honor to be here with the direction Hampshire is taking, striving for sustainability. It matters here, and it matters all over the world. As we lay on the ground, Alan covered in the blood, they formed a firing squad around us, putting the guns to our heads. As they shouted Australia, I shouted no. They would kick me in the stomach. When I would get my breath back, I'd say no, America, America. And I took my passport out, the only thing I had left, and I threw it at them. And I was born in Washington, D.C., and they could see, and we just kept saying America. At some point, they took the guns from our heads. We believe because we were from the same country their weapons were from, they would have to pay a price for killing us that they'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese. They moved on. We were able to get to the bishop's house, Bishop Carlos Jimenez Bello, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize. So many thousands were taking refuge there, but we knew we had not succeeded in stopping this massacre. They killed more than 270 Timorese on that day, and that was one of the smaller massacres. We knew we had to get word to the outside world. Only pressure from the outside would make the difference. And so the bishop helped me clean up Alan. His skull was just a bathing cap of blood. He gave him a new shirt. I put his bloody shirt under a towel that the bishop gave me because I knew we had to have evidence. They would deny that they killed the Timorese, but what about what happened to us? And so we had someone take 18 pictures of us. I hid them away, the film, and then we made our way to the airport. The whole city was shut down. The troops were going to the streets, and they were continuing to shoot. We got to the airport. When we got up to the counter, there was one plane left. We said we needed to get on that plane. We would be back. They were screaming. They were shouting security. It was either a mix-up in communication, or they had decided at the site that they didn't want to kill us, and now they wanted us out of the country. They killed more than 270 Timorese on that day. As we made our way to the plane and we got into it, as the plane doors closed, the flight attendants gave me a silver bowl of water and said, "Clean him," because the blood was coming down from Alan's head, down his shoulders. And then we made our way to West Timor, which is part of Indonesia, onto Bali, and there we made the call and said there's been a massacre in Timor. We were able to get on the plane, come here to the United States, report that the massacre had taken place and also that US weapons were used. In this country, a nationwide movement grew up. Starting in 1991, after people heard word of the massacre, the corporate media, not a word about Timor from 1975 when Indonesia invaded, when Walter Cronkite announced the invasion, until the day of the massacre. Only independent media reported the plight of the East Timorese. I want to move on now to 1999 as I wrap up. 1999 was the day the people of East Timor got to vote for their freedom. Because of the activism of people all over the world putting pressure on the UN held a UN-sponsored referendum. I attempted to get into East Timor. You see, the Indonesian military called Alan, Aaron, and I a threat to national security and said we could not return. But I tried to get in. I was caught by the military in Bali. They deported me. I went the next day to Jakarta. They deported me. But Alan did get in. And someone else got in as well. He was a young Hampshire graduate named Sander Tunis. Sander Tunis, who was there also to document what was happening in 1999, when the people of East Timor voted for their freedom overwhelmingly. Sick grandmothers would be taken by bed to the voting booth just so they could make that their last act. And Sander was there to document that as well. Sadly, on September 21st, 1999, Sander was killed as he made his way to the Santa Cruz Cemetery, where that massacre had taken place 8 years before. And I want to honor the Sander Tunis scholars who are here, the scholars who are here to study peace and international studies and journalism, how important that is. And the UN took over East Timor for 3 years, and this is where I'll end. It was 11 years ago, May 20th, 2010, May 20th, 2002, that the people of East Timor celebrated their independence. I was able to get in through Australia. Alan Nairn got in as well. And 100,000 people gathered in a sandy plain next to Dili, the capital, in a sandy plain called Tasitolo. It was midnight. Then the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan gave a speech. There were dignitaries from around the world. And then Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of East Timor, long imprisoned by the Indonesian military, got up. He was the founding president of a new country. He gave a speech in 4 languages. And then he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. There was this fireworks display, and you could see the light reflected in the tear-stained faces of the people of East Timor. They had resisted, and they had won at an unacceptably high price, at an unbelievably high price. 200,000 Timorese killed. But they had won. This nation of survivors had prevailed. And they thanked people from all over the world, especially from the most powerful countries, who would push their governments to stop supplying arms to human rights abusing regimes or using them themselves. And it is a lesson to all of us. Whether we are journalists, professors, librarians, gardeners, whether we are artists, whether we are the graduating class of 2013 of Hampshire College, we have a lesson to learn from the people of East Timor. Whether we want to represent the sword or the shield, democracy now.